Nó là sàn gì hả? Nghe
Hello everyone, we are having a little problems with the technique, but just hang in, we will be here just in a short while.
Ja, har ju någonting, men ja. Ja. Så.
Good.
So. How do we do now? Malena, take me through this. So.
Yes. If you have your presentation.
Yeah, can I just share the screen?
Yeah, or if you choose share, you can choose to share the application or you can share your screen. In the bottom of your screen, you have the share.
Yeah. I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
Looks nice.
I'm just trying to click down all over. a lot of stuff here. And so I can start my presentation. So.
Yes, looks right.
Yeah.
That's good.
Finally.
Yes.
Sorry, everybody, for screwing up.
No, you're not screwing up. We're just learning.
Yeah. Now, what I was thinking of the poor participants there.
Yeah.
Not so much for you, Malena.
I know, Bengt.
So, let me see now who is. Can I see? Return to meeting. Okay. I just wanted to see how is the participants can.
If you go down to the share screen and go free left, you have the participants. There's that one. You can see who's participating in the pane. See Fang, Gabriel, and Ronnie.
Yeah. I have.
I will look at who is supposed to participate, and I will give them, send them a mail, and then with the invitation.
So that's
the 7-person team.
So now I've got your form covered. So sorry for this taking some time before we could get this up and running. We used a different system this morning because I made it this morning as well. And then when I started here, I didn't get into the right system.
So. We're trying out using Zoom in our webinars, but we have to do it in another system, Teams, this morning, because you cannot run 2 Zoom meetings at the same time, being a host. So that is why we're having a little startup problems.
So it was easier when I did it in Teams this morning.
Yes, I know, Bengt. That's because you know Teams better than
yeah. And everybody else is working with that as well. That was less complicated. Advantage Teams.
But Zoom has some features that Teams doesn't have.
Yeah. I understand that, but
yeah,
if you can't use them, then it doesn't help.
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
Welcome. I assume, can any one of the others give me a shout just to so I can see that you all can hear me?
Ronnie, can you please unmute your mic and just say hello, and so we know we are here and you can hear us?
Hello.
Perfect.
Perfect. You can hear us as well.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yes, perfectly.
That's good.
Good.
And you can see my presentation as well.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Yes.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we hear you. Yes. So.
And also, guys, if you feel for it and Bengt feels for it, put on the camera, say hello to everybody. It's a little bit more live when you can see each other. And if you don't feel for it, that's okay as well.
Yeah. So you'll see me from the side because I have my camera over there and I'm looking at the screen over there. So let me start the presentation. We're going to talk about, let's see if I can. Application training, near infrared applications. So the agenda for today is I'll start to talk a little about spectroscopy in general, then about different spectrometers, And I will walk you through all the different instruments we have in Near Infra Red at Foss. So that's DS2500, DS2500L for liquids, DA1650, Infratec Nova, Infratec 1241, and Infratec Sophia, FoodScan 2, MeatScan, Olivia, and DairyScan. Then I will, and of course, then talk about the different applications we have for those instruments that are, say, the dedicated applications. And I will also talk a little about other applications and how to develop new applications. Now we start with the electromagnetic spectrum. It covers a wide range of different types of waves, and the shorter wavelength range you have, the higher energy. So if you have gamma rays or X-rays, very short wavelength range, you have a very high energy, and they are damaging to your health if you get exposed to those. The further up you go, up to radio waves, you know that they are very long waves and they have no impact whatsoever on your health. Now, in the middle here is a small visible light region. It's very tiny, as you can see. And it's limited at the lower end in UV by the proteins in your eye. So you can't see those because the proteins in your eye will absorb the light. And in the high end, it's because the water you have in your eyes that absorbs the near infrared light. And then you have near infrared and then infrared, and infrared is heat radiation. Now, when we talk about spectroscopy, it's molecular vibrations when it comes to near infrared and infrared. And in principle, all the molecular vibrations we see are in infrared. So what we see is in near infrared is overtunes. I will come back to that. What happens in infrared is that the molecules, they vibrate, they have different types of vibrations. You can see stretching, bending, and so on. And all of those vibrations are controlled, so you can only change the vibrations in certain steps, quantum steps. So if you send light in with different energy levels, it will only absorb of the specific level that can make it to jump one step. And then you'll get a peak response, so you get some absorbed energy. If there's no match, no absorbance, and no peak. So molecular absorptions happens in the mid-infrared range, and none of them in the NIR range. So what you have in infrared is called fundamental frequency for an absorption. So that is when it actually things change. And what can happen then is that not only one energy level is changed, but you have two or more happens at the same time. So the peak or absorption that shows up at the lower wavelength with higher energy. This is then typically called an overtone with reference to music, or multiples of a frequency are called overtunes. Overtunes are normally wider in range and overlapping each other. So it's really hard to use them for analytical purposes. When you are up in mid-infrared, you normally have nice separated sharp peaks. So you can use them to identify things and so on. So for example, what you call a fingerprint area that can be used in the infrared. That's not the case. So, but now, so the last years, 20, 30, 40 years back, with the introduction of modern computers, it's become possible to mathematically separate the overlapping peaks and use them for quantitative analysis. And this type of mathematics is called chemometrics. So that's something you hear frequently in Foss language, is to talk about chemometrics. So instead of having 3 points make a line, which is typically would you use in a simple case where you have one peak absorbing from a change in the molecules, you will have where you can just plot the peak height or the peak area towards the concentration and get a nice calibration out of that. You need to use statistics instead. Use statistical algorithms to make an indirect mathematical relationship with your spectra. This is why we need such a high number of samples for doing calibrations. More higher numbers give better statistics. And if you're going to work with this, it's really good to have some understanding of statistics. So you know a little how statistics works, and also, of course, if you can get some training on chemometrics, so the specific statistics used in for doing calibrations like this, it's really good. It can otherwise be a little confusing, and it's also hard to explain to people who doesn't really understand it. This is a picture I used trying to describe a little how the overtones work. So you see you have a bond length, and then we have a change. You see the first overtone, second overtone, and third overtone, and actually the energy is less between them, but as they change, but it will be higher energy levels that is required. So then we'll look a little on the different ways of doing spectroscopy. We have transmittance, we have reflectance. Foss have instruments using both these technologies. And the picture here illustrates the difference between them. It is, of course, more true to use transmittance, where you have a light going through the complete sample. And this is particularly important when you have samples that are unhomogeneous, so like grain or pellets or something like that, which meat, where it's not a really homogeneous sample. For reflectance, we look at the surface. There it's more important that you actually have a homogeneous sample, so you need to grind it or mix it in some way so you get a more homogeneous sample. Then you look at the surface, and it doesn't penetrate very deeply, so you must be sure that the surface is representative of the sample. Now, so in our case, transmittance is typically used in infratechs and food scans, where you have these unhomogeneous samples like grains and meat, while reflectance is mainly used for solid samples where you mill the sample and have some type of powder. Now this is how it looks inside a Foss instrument. No, that was not what I wanted to do. There's a pointer. Page up. So this is how it looks inside a Foss instrument, where you have a sample cup, you have a light source coming from the monochromator, so you have one wavelength coming up, hitting the sample, and then it's reflected down on the detectors. This is then a picture taken on the instrument with where normally the cup is sitting. So this is how it looks when it's open for taking a scan. So you have the light coming in here in the middle, and then you have detectors, and there's actually 8 detectors, 4 of them being silicon detectors and 4 of them being lead sulfide detectors. And for the type of sample we have, it's really important that you have a big area to collect the light from, because if the sample is not very homogeneous, and in most cases it's not when we on the sample types we have, it's important that the detector area is big, so you get as much different types of light coming back to the detectors as possible, so to give a true representation of the sample. Now let's look at a couple of different spectra so you can see how the spectra look like. These spectra are picked out from Foss Manager, so you can all, if you want to look at the spectra, you can of course do that. In most cases, you can do it on the instrument. You can of course export the spectra and look at it, but you can also in Foss Manager or in the local configurator look at the spectra. And this is a typical spectra of a feed sample. If you look, this is the visible range here. So you see there's a high absorption in the visible range, telling me it's a dark sample. And typically, most feed samples are quite dark. And here you have then the part of the spectra that we use for compositional analysis. So you can see that there's a walked up peak and protein peaks and so on. And you can see these are the different subsamples. They are quite identical. And yeah, and this is typical thing also for reflectance spectra is that the absorption is normally below 1 absorbance unit or around 1 absorbance unit. And it's a little cell path length. I mean, because it's reflectance, there's not one path length. It's little self-adjusting, so to say, because the lower wavelength range here penetrates deeper into the sample and then reflects back. So you get a little higher absorption than you would get if you did transmission. While here for the higher wavelength range, the penetration depth is a little shorter, giving less absorption to it. So you get a nice spectra that you can use over the whole range. The next spectra here is very low in absorbance on the visible range, so telling me that it's a white spectra. I think this is flour, normal wheat flour, but you see that the peaks and the shape of the spectra is very similar. So it's the more too big part, the same type of chemicals in the sample. Then if we look at the transmission spectra, this is from a DS2500 liquid. So this is an edible oil. It absorbs here in the visible range, it absorbs blue light, which means when you look at it, it's yellow. So the blue light is absorbed by the sample and the yellow light goes straight through it. So when you look at it, it looks yellow. But you see here that the peaks here in this range are very small, while the ones here, when you come up to the higher wavelength range, is much bigger. So this is typically then a true representation of the absorption when all of it have the same path length. So it's very small here, but absorptivity up here in the higher range is much higher. If we then instead look at an Infratech, this is very high absorption also. This is actually so much so you can't see through it at all. So this is totally black. So this is the limitation of the instrument, and 5.5 absorbance units is really, really dark when you compare this to what we had before when we were below 1, which is very far down. Doesn't make a big difference because in Infratechs and food scans, we're only using this small range up here between 850 and 1050. And this is how all the spectra look in an Infratech. They have a small peak here and a bigger peak here. And more or less independent of what kind of sample you have, it will look the same. And that's why you need these statistical tools to make calibrations for it, because for the eye, they will look the same, but using statistics, you can actually see the difference. And it's the same for a food scan. So this is a food scan 2. You see it's a little similar here. This is also the limitation of the instrument. It actually goes up all the way up to 6 absorbance units, and then it drops down when the sample becomes transparent. And this is using the same wavelength part from 850 to 1050. And the big peak here you see is water, because this is a meat sample, 70% of the meat is water. But again, they will all more or less look the same, all of the samples here. And if you have questions, you're welcome to unmute your mics and ask questions.
You actually have a question on the chat, Bengt?
Yeah, I don't have the chat because I have the presentation in front of me.
Yes, let me just read it for you. How deep will NIR light penetrate into the sample in reflectance mode? Suppose sample are well grind.
Well, it's if you do reflectance, it will do in the or shorter wavelength range, it will penetrate maybe say 1 millimeter, 1 to 2 millimeters. When you go higher up around 2000, it will be maybe 0.1, 0.2 millimeters. So it's a very narrow part of the surface it will penetrate. And you can compare that then to an infratech where you have normally 18 millimeter for a wheat sample or a meat sample where you have 13 millimeters. So when you use the lower wavelength range, you get a much bigger representation of the sample. Okay, let me see if I can back here. So spectrometers, I will go through the three most common ones. It's the monochromators that we are using, the microsensor interferometer, also called FT-NIR, and diode array. There is also a number of what's called MEMS, micro electromechanical systems, but they're not really practical. And I would say very few of them are in use in our industry because they are, one of the reasons being they are so small. So they have a very small light beam. And when you use samples like grains and pellets and things like that, you want big light beams and big detectors. A tiny beam will only work if you have something that's totally homogeneous. So they're not practical. So if we start with a DS20, we start with an infratech food scan. So predispersive monochromator in transmittance. So the predispersive means that it split up the light first. So you have a lamp, an entrance slit, a grating. The grating splits up the light in the different wavelengths. It goes through the sample and hits a detector. And as the grating moves, you will have different wavelengths coming through the sample. So it scans one wavelength at a time. This is then the typical setup we have for the infratechs, but also for the DS2500L. And then we have the reflectance, looks in the same way. You have a lamp, an entrance slit, a grating that splits up the light in the different wavelengths. It hits the sample, but then we look at the reflected light instead. Principles are very much the same. Now, one of the things that's over the years been a complication for near infrared instruments based on monochromators has been that the instruments have not been identical. So if you look at an old System 2 instrument, you had to do some kind of a data manipulation to be able to use a calibration from one instrument to a second instrument. That was not very convenient, so Foss have put in quite some effort to come up with a system where we can make instruments identical, so no standardization is required. Now, we still call it factory standardization, but it's this kind of standardization where the customer doesn't need to do anything. And the way we do that is we have a filter inside the instrument. Filter have a number of sharp peaks, and we use those peaks to specify the wavelength. So we set the wavelength response from that. We also look at the band pass, which means the width of the peaks, and we correct for that. The instrument itself is actually having a little smaller band pass than we want, and then we use mathematics to widen it a little. We also look at the photometric response between the base and the peak on a couple of points to make sure that the response is accurate and within our specification. This means that instruments are identical. So if you do a calibration on one instrument, you can move it to a second instrument without doing anything and get the same result. That's and this is how the absorbance spectra look like for the filter inside the instrument. And you can see it's a lot of sharp peaks that we can use, and we use a number of them to verify the wavelength and the bandwidth for the instrument. So a little about monochromators then. They are very good because they have a high signal to noise ratio, which means that we can get very accurate measurements made for protein or other parameters we have. That's quantitative analysis. It uses a big light beam. So the light beam is like 7 millimeters across the diameter. And it's even a little bigger when it hits the sample in the DS2500. It's about that size on an Infratech or a food scan. So that's really good for inhomogeneous samples. It's also a robust system, so it can be used in a harsh environment. And it's using this built-in filter for wavelength stability. So the instrument will not change over its lifetime. Then the next one is what's called a Michelson's interferometer. Now that's it's more common to call it an FT-NIR, or the FT stands for Fourier transform. But the spectrometry itself is actually called a Michelson's interferometer. This works in the way that you have a light source, a mirror that lets half of the light through. So half of the light goes here, reflected on this fixed mirror, reflected back, and then to the sample, while the other one is reflected up here. This is a moving mirror, reflected back to the sample, through the sample and to the detector. So the sample is normally positioned here just before the detector. The reason for doing like this is that this is developed for the infrared range, and detectors in the infrared range have always been bad. Infrared is in principle heat radiation, so it's a thermometer you have of some kind. So they're not very sensitive. So to improve that, the more light you can put on it, the better signal you will get. So having all the light hitting it, that would improve the signal there. Well, if you look at the near infrared we have with the predispersive, it's only one wavelength at a time. So you need to have much more sensitive detectors there. And we have. Now, what you get out from an interferometer is an interferogram. And it looks like this. So it's nothing at all like the spectra we have. So what you do to this is you need to do Fourier transform. So you get it to look like a normal spectra. And this is a spectra from an FT1. So this is mid-infrared rather than near infrared. The noisy parts you see here are where there's water peaks. And for the Milko scans, we use water as a reference. So when you scan a sample, then the water peak is actually removed. Sorry. So that's why it's very noisy in these areas, but the rest of the area you can use for all the other determinations we do. And that will of course be the similar for FT-NIR instruments, where the water peak is much less, and it normally is using then air as a reference. So little about interferometers or FT-NIR. They have an adjustable resolution. For the monochromators we have, the resolution is fixed. For the FT, you can actually change it. High resolution is good if you want to do qualitative or identification measurements, which in principle, we don't. We have this possibility to do it. We haven't focused so much on doing it. NIR is not really good for that. Infrared, mid-infrared is much better. Because of the moving mirror there, it's very sensitive to vibrations. And if you use the high resolution, you get a very low signal to noise, which means if you want to use it with the high resolution for qualitative measurements, it's really bad for quantitative. So you can't use it for both at the same time, because that doesn't really work well. They do have a good transferability between the instrument. Then the last one is the diode array. This is what we call a post-dispersive, which means it's dispersing the light after it hit the sample. So you have a lamp with all the different wavelengths hitting the sample. The reflected light, or could be the transmitted light, is going through, hits a grating, and the grating is fixed. It's not moving as it's in the monochromators. And then the light is split up, and there's an array of detectors, typically 256 detectors in an array here. So it's solid state, nothing moving, so it can work in really hard environments. It's not sensitive at all to vibrations. One of the drawbacks is it doesn't have so good transferability, because resolution is lower than you have on the monochromators. It's not sensitive to stray light, so it can work in an open environment. So if you have a conveyor belt or something like that, it can work there. There is, of course, a risk of heating the sample. So if you have a strong lamp looking at the sample, it can heat up the sample, and then you will lose moisture. It can also measure on a moving sample because it collects all the wavelengths at the same time. So if you have a conveyor belt that's moving, it will, at every time it looks at the sample, it will collect the whole spectra. While if you look at the monochromator or an interferometer, they will scan over the range, so to say, while the sample is moving, and then you will have different pictures in different part of the sample at the different wavelengths, and that will cause some problems for you. So we typically use the diode arrays in instruments that are very close to production or in production, as a Foss or Medscan or Infratech Sophia DA1650. Then some common misconceptions. Some people claim that the FT-NIR is a new technology. It depends on how you define new, of course. It's from 1887. The first one was used. To me, that's quite old. Also, there's about the FT-NIR being more transferable, as it uses a laser for wavelength correction. That is true. It's very transferable, but the monochromators we have and the system for standardization we have for our monochromators, it's very accurate. So the built-in filter guarantees that it doesn't drift over time. And also this with the FT-NIR having a higher resolution. That is correct, but if you use that feature, you will also get a higher noise. So if you look at what we are doing and how we use our instruments, in general, our instrument is better for quantitative measurements than an FT-NIR is. Then diode array, it's very fast. It's been pointed out as being much faster than other spectrometers, and that is true when you have light samples, but it's using time as an amplification. So if you have something that's really dark, it will actually take a long time. And absorbance is a logarithmic scale, so it increases from, when it goes from one absorbance unit to two absorbance units, it's a tenfold in time that it's changing. And monochromators typically take less than a second per scan. So when we look at the spectra, so look at sample, we say it takes a minute. it's not so much the scanning time that takes a minute. It's the time it takes to move the sample and do the subsampling and so on that takes time. Okay, before I now start with going through all the different instruments, I have excluded Foss because Foss is a process instrument and it's not so dependent on the application as it is on where you're actually going to place it. And in principle, we always need to do some application development for a process instrument. And my general recommendation is don't sell process instruments to customers if they don't really already have a bench instrument. They need to be aware of the pros and cons with an NIR before they start to put it into a process environment. It is much more complicated to do that than have a bench instrument. So we start with DS2500 and the DS2500F, and they are the same instrument. They have a little different wavelength area. So the normal DS has from 400 to 2500, while the F starts at 850 and goes to 2500. So the F doesn't cover the visible range. It's also so that Foss only sells the F version to feed and forage applications. And the reason for this is pure marketing. It doesn't really have anything to do with the technology or anything like that. It's just that price competition is hard on feed and forage area, so therefore an F is a little cheaper, and to make a difference between them, the visible range was removed. That's the way it is. Then if we look at some of the specification here, the 0.5 nanometer data resolution is how wide the steps are when you collect the spectra and you export it. So when you look at the spectra, there will be points with 0.5 nanometers difference. Doesn't make any difference really to how the instrument performs. The important thing is what's called the optical bandwidth, which is 8.75. That is how wide a peak is when you measure it. If you have an infinite small peak and you measure that, that will be 875, halfway up to the top. And then we have the wavelength accuracy and precision on one single instrument and precision from instrument to instrument. These numbers are important for us when we develop instruments, and they are important when we develop calibrations because they go together. So now saying that calibrations can be moved from one instrument to another instrument, it's important that we stay within these specifications to make that possible. And it also have some influence sometimes when we develop calibrations that the calibration itself need to be able to work within this variation. So someone has the mic unmuted. Can you mute that? Then we look at the operating temperature. It's from 5 to 40, which is normally much more than you will stand when you, for a working environment. Humidity less than 93. That means it shouldn't rain. If it comes above this, you really have a wet weather. And it's IP65, which means that the instrument itself is protected from dust and water. So you can pour water on top of it, and that doesn't make any difference. And it's completely sealed for dust as well. Now, you need to have a computer to run it. So if you put a computer beside this, most of the computers will not be IP65, and the computer will be the first thing that breaks down if you're in a dust environment. Cups. Different cups we have. Small cup, typically used for powders, as we can see here in this example. You have the cup, you have a holder for the small cup. This is a small pin here in it to make it come in the right position. This is the large cup, typically used then for grains or pellets and things like that. No pin, you can place it whatever you like. For this large cup, there's also an extension. Looks like this. It's for forage samples, so we have grass straws and things like that. You need this extension. And obviously you need to run this with the lid open, and that works fine. Then we have a slurry cup. Looks like this. This assumes then that when you have a slurry, you will have a more homogeneous sample, so you can just need one measuring point. That will be here then. And this is made also so it's easier to clean if you have something that's sticky, so you need to wash it. Now, if you have a liquid, you can also use the slurry cup together with the gold reflector. You put a couple of drops of your liquid here, take the gold reflector, put it on top of this, and you get a transmission spectra. So this is typically if you want to measure oils or something like that. So if we then start to look at applications, we start with the DS2500F. So F for feed and forage. So it's only feed and forage applications here. Compound feed. Compound feed covers all different type of processed feed. So it's independent if it's for chicken or for pigs or for cows, or horses. It's compound feed. And then most of the others is raw materials, cereals and grains, different type of grains. Fish meal, that's what we don't eat ourselves. They mix into fish meal as a raw material with very high protein content to mix into the compound feed. Vegetal protein meals, typically soya meal or rapeseed meal, where there's no oil left. It's been pressed out, and then what's left is with high protein. Vegetal byproducts, anything that's left that doesn't become food can be a vegetal byproduct. Also, things from the brewing industry, for example, is used here. Wet pet food typically comes from a can. Dry pet food, and typically in a bag. Looks very much like compound feed. Then we have silage, grass silage, or forage. It's more or less, it's the same, just different words. So grass silage, this calibration also includes wet alfalfa, corn silage, corn, and then we have an alfalfa, which is then the dry material. It's dried up in pellets or just dried up. The calibrations normally cover protein, moisture, ash, fat, starch, and fiber. This is in principle always what we analyze. These parameters are the standard parameters. There's other parameters, of course, but this is the standard ones. And of course, if you look at the application notes, you can get more details. And we have application notes on everything we sell. Then we have this with amino acids. Amino acids is a special one. And Foss doesn't have any calibrations for it. And people ask, oh, why can't you do that? Well, yes, we can, but we have chosen not to. And the reason for that is in principle two. One, it's very expensive and very complicated to do calibrations for amino acids. The second one, which is, I guess, the most valid one, is that a lot of our key customers have their own amino acid calibrations, and they use that as a sales argument for selling their products, additives to the feed industry. And we don't really want to compete with them. So we let them sell the calibrations to our customers, and they also, because they have calibrations for our instrument, they also help us to sell our instruments. So it's a benefit for both of us. We also want to stay out of the discussions if our calibrations are different than the ones they have, because we have a small feeling that there may be small differences between them, that the An Evonik calibration may point at Evonik additives, while a Nutreco calibration may point at Nutreco additives. It's just a suspicion, but it could be like that. And then we don't want to stick in a Foss calibration in the middle and say everybody else is wrong. You should use a Foss calibration instead. And we have quite a good cooperation with all these companies that sells additives. So in many cases, they're actually very helpful to sell our instruments. Some of them is also pointing at Bruker's Tango instrument, but in principle, all of them have either a Foss DS2500 or a Bruker Tango as the recommended instruments. That means there's a lot of competition just disappears if anyone wants to do amino acids, because those additive companies, they don't offer calibrations for other instruments than those two. Application notes. We have application notes for all calibrations. Application notes are found on Foss Extranet and on SharePoint Service Toolbox. If you don't have access, you should get access. Talk to your area manager or talk to your Foss manager. Make sure you have access to that. There's a lot of interesting information and it's more or less the same information in both places there. Service Toolbox is a little more focused on technical material, while the extranet also have some sales material. Now, in the application notes for Near Infra Red, we have a disclaimer saying this is an example of performance. So there's no guarantee of any specific performance for any NIR application. For some of the milk applications, for Milko scans, it is actually a guarantee that we will reach that performance that's stated in the application note. And the reasons for being different is just history. It's historical reasons for why it's like that. When it comes to, yes? Do you want to say something? No? In most cases, we actually do better than what we state in the application note, because in the application note, where we look at the performance there, we look at multiple matrices, so sample types. We also look at multiple reference labs. So there could be variation based on the sample types and on the reference labs. Just because it's a reference lab doesn't mean it's extremely accurate. While in most cases, when a customer will make a comparison, they will have one sample type and one reference lab, and that will normally give a better result on the performance. Then if we look at the DS2500 applications, of course, we'll do all the feed and forage that we have for the F model. But we also have a lot of applications and calibrations for sugar, both sugar cane and sugar beet. So we're covering more or less the complete sugar process there. We have flour, wheat flour and corn flour. And we also do whole grains, wheat and rye. This is also something we can do on Infratech. So Infratech also have flour as well as whole grains. And the split we normally try to do between them is if the main application is flour, then we recommend a DS2500. If the main application is whole grains, we recommend an Infratech. But both can do both things. Then we have dairy products, and this is typically then the powder parts of a dairy. So whole milk powder, skim milk powder, whey powder, ice cream mix, infant formulas, and things like that. So then when we get to the dairy products that are semi-solids, it's typically a food scan, and if it's liquids, it's a Milko scan. Then we can also do color with the DS2500. That is a calibration that's coming out now, any day now. And that will do color with real color units as LIB units. it's not only that we can actually measure in the visible range, that we can actually do a color. Color is different. It's a different calculation than we normally do. So it's not just a calibration, it's a calculation based on the mathematics used for this LIB units. And then we have a number of starter calibrations for different things: tomato, coffee, chocolate, tea, more. DS2500L for liquid. The only application we have here is edible oils. And as you can see, the instrument is in principle the same. It's a DS2500, but instead of having the rotating part for this cup, it has a holder for vials, cuvettes here. And this holder can then is easily to change depending on the vial on the cuvette you're using. Specifications are similar to the DS2500. It's using a silicon detector for the lower range, and actually here it's using the indium gallium arsenide detector for the high range. It works in transmission, and the monochromator itself is the same as in the DS2500. So this is a replacement for the XDS Rapid Liquid Analyzer. So it's fully transferable if you want to move calibrations from an XDS to the DS2500L. It normally uses 4 or 8 millimeter vials, round vials, so one-time use. Or you can have cuvettes, square cuvettes, 1, 2, 5, and 10 millimeters. We're also working on a 1 millimeter flow cuvette and a 1 millimeter vial. That's coming a little later. It's a little tricky to do it on 1 millimeter round. Now, Foss only have calibrations for edible oils, but it can of course be used for any liquid application. And if you want to develop something or you do something new, please contact Foss and we'll help you with that. DA1650. It's based on a diode array spectrometer with 256 pixels. This is the common configuration. It works from 1100 to 1650 nanometers, so it has a limited wavelength range. In-gas detector, 0.5 nanometer data resolution, but the optical bandwidth is 10.44, so it's a little wider than a DS2500. And its wavelength accuracy is 0.5 nanometers, so it's not at all as good as the DS2500. And this is also the main reason why the transferability is not as good on a DS1650 as it is on a DS2500. Precision and stability is good. Temperature range is 5 to 40, and same as for the DS. Humidity is 93%, and it's IP65 protected. Now, this is as a difference to the DS2500, where you need a computer on the side. The computer is built in here. So if you really want to be safe side, if you have a bad environment, this is a better option because also the computer is built in and IP65 protected. We sell the DA1650 in principle only for feed and forage applications. The exception is the oil crushing packages we have, where you can buy a package for rapeseed or soya. That will then cover whole seeds, oil, and meal and cake. Meal and cake is done for the raw materials for feed. Otherwise, it's the same products as we have for DS2500F, with the compound feed, cereals, grains, fish meal, vegetal protein meals, vegetal byproducts, dry and wet pet food, grass silage, corn silage, and alfalfa. We do not recommend that people develop their own calibrations for a DA1650 because it's a little more complicated than for a DS2500. So typically when people want to develop their own calibrations, it's a DS2500 we recommend. Infratechs. There's a lot of Infratechs. Infratech Nova, Infratech 1241, and Infratech Sophia. The three ones here are in principle the same. They are using the same calibrations, even though it's in different file formats, but they're using the same calibration, so you get the same result. And they're monochromator based. The Sophia is based on a diode array, and of course using different calibrations, so it's a little different. The new Infratex there, the TM and the Nova, scanning monochromator. The TM works from 570 to 1100, while the Nova works from 400 to 1100. And as with the DS2500 and F, this is just a marketing thing. There's different prices on them, so there must be a difference on the instruments as well. So one of those things that differ is the wavelength range. Now, all the calibrations we have are from 850 to 1050. So all the calibrations works on both instruments. It's only if you want to develop something yourself, you need to look at the wavelength range. And in principle, no one is doing the wrong calibrations for Infratex. 0.5 nanometer data resolution, and the optical bandwidth is 7, so it's a little sharper here than on the DS. Otherwise, wavelength accuracy and precision is the same, so it's 0.2 and 0.015 on the precision. And it goes the same here. If you do a calibration on one instrument, you can move it to a second instrument and you get the same result. Operating temperature, it goes up to 45 from 5 degrees. Some people claim they have very hot environments. I would not like to be when it's above 40 to work in that kind of environment, but that may be the case in some places. Humidity, less than 93 relative humidity, and this is IP54, so it's dust and waterproof. It's a little open because the connectors and things like that are not special, but it's so well protected, so any dust or water coming into the instrument will not have any effect on the performance of the instrument. To the Infratech, you can buy different modules. There's a test weight module inside. You have a sample transport module and a flour module. We'll get through them. Flour module is, of course, mainly for wheat flour, and also, as we discussed before, our recommendation for a miller to mainly flour would be a DS2500. But if the main application is whole grains, you can also work the other way and say, yes, we can do flours with the Infratech. 3 different cups with different path lengths, so there's different thickness. They are color-coded, blue, silver, and black. And if you look at it, you'll say, no, they're all gray. No, they're not. This is blue, this is silver, and this is black. The plastic around them is gray. And this is then the combination of the type of flour you can use them for. Soft flour is then wheat flour. Semolina is normally for pasta. And you have sunflower flour, which is very dark, so it has a very small path length. Test weight module, test weight or bulk densities, it's a density meter. It's a cup with the lid at the bottom, so it will close and it will be filled up with grain. It's actually topped up, and then there's an arm that sweeps it off, so it's always filled to the same level. It measures the weight, calculates the density, or what's called a test weight. Test weight, there's no high and low on a test weight. It's just the right level. When you have different grains, they should have a certain test weight. And you can have that for the Infratech, TM, 1241, and Nova, not for Sophia. Sample transport module is for those who want to run special samples, small sample volumes, or special sample types that doesn't flow through the conveyor. This would typically be plant breeding or maltsters, or if you want to do a liquid. This does not exist for the Infratech TM. So this is one of the things that differs the Infratech from the Infratech Nova. So anyone who wants to use this needs to have an Infratec Navbar or all 1241. The top-loaded cuvette is also for the STM. It's just made up, so it's a little, you can pour the sample in and pour it out, so it's a little easy to work with now. And then the cuvettes you have normally for the sample transport module. Infratec applications. The main applications are a whole grain analysis. Any whole grains, wheat, barley, oat, rye, corn, maize, rapeseed, canola, triticale, beans, lupins, soya beans, peas, malt, rice, and anything. That's the main applications. The parameters: protein, moisture, test weight, fat, starch, and fiber, the standard parameters. In principle, all Infratecs are sold with Foss calibrations. I don't really know of anyone. Well, there's very, very few that develop any calibrations for Infratecs. Infratecs are acknowledged as the world standard when it comes to grain analysis, and we have approvals from a lot of countries: US, France, Russia, Australia, Germany, Japan, and so on those instruments. So it's the world standard, and the standard is using the Foss calibration. So the instruments, it's not only the instruments, but also the calibrations are approved by those governments for trading. There is also some smaller applications for plant breeding, flour milling, as I said, for the flour module, maltsters, and also liquids like beer, whiskey, and spirits. You can actually do that on an Infratec if you want to. FoodScan 2 actually. I'm not talking about FoodScan 1 here, it's past. And as you can see, Foss is using colors to differentiate. It's blue to the left, it's blue to the right, and it's all blue. So you can see the difference between the different instruments. So it's a FoodScan Pro, FoodScan Lab, or a Lab TS. So what's the difference between them? Yeah, that's a good question. This is with a higher IP classification. There's also a cover on the back, so you get this as an IP65, totally sealed off. This has an IP54, so it has open connectors in the back and so on. So it's still protected, but not as good. And then you have one that's still an IP54, but it needs a computer on the side, which means that you will be dependent on the IP classification of the computer. It has a scanning monochromator, the same as in the Infratecs, 400 to 1100 transmission. Now this differs because it has 3 detectors. So it actually splits up the light in 3 different parts. This gives a bigger part of the sample is measured because of this. So it gives you a better average, so to say, of the sample. Data resolution, optical bandwidth, and accuracy and so on is the same as on the Infratec. So it's 7 nanometers, 0.2 nanometers in accuracy, 0.015 on precision. Same temperature as for the Infratecs, up to 45. Humidity less than 93. And the lab is then IP54, and the Pro is IP65. And then you have this, what they call a black box on the back to tighten up for the connectors. Applications for the FoodScan. It's dairy and meat mainly. So it's butter and spreads, fermented dairy products. That's what I call the semi-solids parts. So butter and yogurt, fresh and cream cheese. Then you have the solids, which is cheese, blue cheese. You have meat products, raw meat, processed meat, sausage, salami. So that covers a lot. Fish and fish products. And now the odd one is color. This is something new. This requires a special module. As I said before, color is typically measured in reflectance. FoodScan is working in transmission. So if you want to do color, you need to add an extra detector. So it will have then a reflectance detector. So you can actually get the color to see if your meat is red or if it's gray, or your blue cheese is blue. It's the standard parameters, fat, protein, moisture, but here we also have calibrations for salt, total solids, and saturated fat. And color, of course, as special, so it's measuring reflectance. Olive scan 2, this is only released in Spain. And if you think it looks very much like a food scan, you're completely correct. It is a food scan with a different label on it. So this is specific for olive paste and olive pomace for laboratories and larger olive producers. Then we have Olivia, which is the smaller version for doing olives, pomace and paste. Analyzes fat and moisture only. Meat scan, fat and moisture only for meat. Dairy scan, fat and moisture only for cheese. And big surprise, it's actually the same instrument, all three of them. It's just different labels on them to make them dedicated analyzers with dedicated calibrations. This is also then based on diode array, silicon diode array, 400 to 1100 nanometers in transmission, 0.5 nanometer data resolution, 7 nanometers in optical bandwidth. So having the same optical bandwidth as a food scan, so calibrations can be transferred. 0.2 nanometers in wavelength accuracy and 0.15 on precision. Works in the temperature from 5 to 40 and humidity less than 93, and it's IP54, so it's dust and waterproof. And with the built-in PC then. So this has very specific for Olivia for olives, meat scan for meat, and dairy for dairy products. Then a little about calibrations and application development. WinISI, as you probably heard about, has been the calibration software for Foss for many years. That was end of sales in June 2020. So we don't sell WinISI anymore. What we have today is Foss Calibrator. Foss Calibrator is a little different. It's of course much more modern, and it's based on cloud applications. So you connect to a cloud somewhere, and all the calculations are done on the server rather than on your own PC. And it's Foss Calibrator is also made up so it will guide you through calibration process. You still need to understand calibration technology, statistics, and mathematics to do it, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense for you. But the software is made up so it will guide you as much as possible and at least prevent you from doing really stupid mistakes. So it will come up with warnings and say, well, you have too little samples for doing a PLS calibration, or you have too many outliers, or something like that. And if you want to do calibrations, we recommend a full face-to-face training. And as I said, some mathematical training before. There's a lot of books on chemometrics if you want to study. Other applications than the one that we have specific application notes for. We are always trying to develop some new applications. So we have something called market innovation, but also product managers are looking for new applications. Some examples here: cocoa and chocolate, coffee, egg, condiments, soy sauce, ketchup, snacks, nuts and chips, confectionaries, tea, mushroom, rubber, palm oil, tobacco, and so on. So if you run into something we don't have an application note on, please contact us and let us know that you have customers interested in something, and we will help you, first of all, to determine if it's possible to do it. Secondly, if we have an interest of helping, or you should do it, have the customer to do it themselves. Now, developing new calibrations. A And that's really exciting. And we have a lot of people coming in and saying, oh, I have this researcher here, he wants to do that. And I have that person there, he wants to do these specific things. No one have ever done this before. And yes, there is a reason why no one has ever done that before. Most likely it doesn't work. I have worked with Near Infra Red for more than 30 years. And I would say almost everything has been tested. So when this was a new technology, a lot of researchers, of course, tried everything. And since then, a lot of other people have tried everything. So by now, most of the things have been tested and verified. Yes, it works. Now it doesn't work. So for us, and I also tell you this, that the first years when I worked with NIR, I did a lot of application testing. And of course, I made some reports, put them in a binder. And after 2 years, I took out the binders and started to look how many instruments did we sell based on these application investigations. And I did. And that was a really disappointing story. That was not much we sold on that. So when we compare that to what we do today, from a business point of view, selling Infratex for doing protein and moisture in wheat is much better business than develop calibrations for some strange chemical that people never heard about. So it's a strong recommendation from me to be very cautious when you want to develop something new. And of course, look at the money. So will customers pay for your time if you do something? And if not, why don't they want to pay for it? Will they pay for the calibrations once you developed it? How much time do you want to spend? Of course, we want to promote new application areas, but please talk to us. I mean, I'm not the only one with a lot of experience. We have several other people in second line with long experience and good knowledge of what can be done and not done. So when you have people who want to do something new, my recommendation is don't develop it yourself unless you get paid. Make sure you get paid. Sell the tools to the people and tell them that you can develop your own calibrations. That's not a problem. There's a million books on internet and other places where you can read about how you make calibrations and the tools you need, the instruments you need, what can be measured, how accurate it can be measured, and so on. And of course, Foss application nets. So give advice on what can be done, what have been done in the past, Google applications. There's a lot of information out there in the world. But don't spend too much time on support that doesn't give any money back. And then when you talk to people, there's 3 questions. Always ask the following: the expected range for the constituents, the expected accuracy, and the accuracy of the reference method, because we can't be better than the reference method. So if they think they have a reference method that gives you 0.5 and they want to have 0.3, it's a no-go. And when you do this, also get a commitment for a purchase if you do the job. If you do any kind of job for helping them, get a commitment either for purchase of the instrument or purchase of the calibrations or the work hours or whatever you want, but get some kind of a written commitment for money. Then there are some general rules of thumb for the applications. So we can normally measure from 0.1 to 100%, whatever it is you want to measure. Accuracy is normally between 0.1 and 1%. Repeatability is normally half of the standard error prediction. Reproducibility is normally close to the repeatability. So it means that if you run the same sample over and over on one instrument, it doesn't matter if you actually suddenly change the instrument and run it on a second instrument, you will get more or less the same result. Inorganic substances, minerals, potassium, sodium, things like that can normally not be measured. any organic with a bond to hydrogen can be measured. So if you have something like moisture, alcohol, fat, proteins, where there's a lot of bonds to hydrogen, they can be measured. So these are the general rules for near infrared applications. But all rules have an exception, of course. But this is the general. Then a little on the most common tested and failed ones that people tend to come back and ask for over and over again. Mycotoxins in grain, no. They are in ppm or even worse, ppb levels, can't do that. Falling number in wheat is not a parameter, it's an enzyme activity and it cannot be measured. Melamine in milk and milk powders, again, we're down on ppm levels, can sometimes be analyzed using FTIR, so the Milker scan, but NIR is not suitable. Minerals in feed, no, doesn't work. Most types of adulteration, no, not very good. In NIR, it's much better to use FTIR, so Milker scans or wine scans. And I have put in some references here. As I said before, there's a million of things written about near infrared spectroscopy and chemometrics and calibrations and so on. So it's just to get some books and start reading. And then a little about Foss Learning. Now we want, before we leave, go to Foss Learning and open the course in My Courses, fill out the course evaluation, tell Bengt how good he is or how bad he is. And I will tick in that you participated, and then you can get a certificate. And then, of course, we have questions. Any questions you want to ask? If I can get this.
You can feel free to use a chat or to unmute your mic and just ask Bengt some questions, or write a question to him in the chat.
So I will stop my share so I can get all this. How difficult? Yeah, that's the one we talked about. That's in the chat already. Any other questions? It's very silent. Falling asleep.
It might be somebody is writing something. Let's just give him a little more time.
Give it a little more time.
Yeah. Okay. It doesn't seem like any questions, Bengt.
No. We will wish you all good luck, and let's keep in touch if you have questions in the future. And I guess we'll just stop the presentation here.
Yeah, and thank you for participating, and see you again another day. And thank you, Bengt, for the presentation.
Yep. Thank you, Malena. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.